Hello, I'm John Nicholson. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I thought this week we should talk a bit more about Trump because his vice president has been in Europe at Munich at the conference there. And Trump, and I know he does this every week, but he has been spewing disinformation, in particular about the Ukraine. Now, many of us have been suspicious of Trump for a long time, and his closeness with Vladimir Putin and his willingness to embrace dictators. He's much more comfortable with the Chinese dictator, with the Russian dictator, with other dictators than he is with elected and democratic leaders. But he seems to have a particularly close tie with Putin. He's been speaking to him on the phone. And in Saudi Arabia this week, there was a meeting between the American Secretary of State and his opposite number, that's the American Foreign Secretary, and his opposite number from Russia. And they discussed the future of Ukraine, crucially, without the Ukrainians being there. We don't know what, if any, agreements were made between the two countries, but we do know this: Ukraine will not sign up for any of them. Ukraine has been subjected to a long and brutal attack by the Russians, and the Ukrainian president is heroic in his stance for his own country, for his own country's freedoms, for democracy and human rights. But listening to Trump, that's not the way he sees it at all. He's swallowed the Kool-Aid, as the Ukrainian president said, the Kool-Aid from Moscow. And he's repeated a number of Moscow-Putin talking points. For example, he said that Ukraine is responsible for starting the war. That's absolute nonsense. Ukraine has been attacked by Russia, an unprovoked attack, an attack that's happened over two phases. Firstly, the Russians attacked Ukraine's southern Crimea region and incorporated it into Russia against international law. And then they started a full-throated attack against Ukraine. They've invaded Ukraine and they're bombing Ukrainian cities and towns, targeting schools and hospitals and civilians. So there's no doubt about who responsibility for this lies with, and it's clearly with President Putin and his regime. Now, you may not know this, and obviously Donald Trump doesn't know this, but Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America guaranteed the current borders of Ukraine in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. It was an international treaty, and the United Nations Security Council said that if Ukraine was ever attacked in the future, it would intervene to save the people of Ukraine. The United Nations Security Council, of course, has broken that promise. But Ukraine's borders, international borders, are guaranteed by international treaty. Now, we thought that we'd ended the habit of one powerful country invading another country in order to change its borders after the Second World War. And we thought that the borders of Europe were secure, and the borders of Europe were guaranteed by Russia, by the United States and the European Union. But Putin has refused to accept this. So, with Donald Trump saying that there has to be a realistic political settlement, what he means is that the Ukrainians must surrender territory and accept that the illegal invasion and force used against them by President Putin becomes formalized. Well, why should they? They fought so long and so hard to defend their liberties and their freedom. And crucially, if Putin gets away with this breach of the international order, he will be emboldened. He will think that he can change borders by force. And he's come for the Ukrainians, he's come for the Georgians, and next, he may well come for the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and try and change their borders too by force. We clearly can no longer trust the United States under Donald Trump. We can no longer rely on him supporting NATO. So I certainly believe that President Zelensky is right when he says that Europe must take responsibility for its own future and its own defence future. We must arm the Ukrainians. We must help the Ukrainians. We must give the Ukrainians a pathway both into the European Union and into membership of NATO, because Russia poses an existential threat to the peace and the security of the European Union and Europe as a whole. We, of course, should be back in the European Union as well as a member of NATO. You know, Ukraine has a long and distinguished history, stretching back more than 1,000 years. And the idea that any country can have its borders changed by force is so deeply offensive that it's hard to imagine an American president ever giving credence to that. But of course, we've never had an American president quite like Donald Trump. He seems enraged by the Ukrainians' desire for liberty and independence. That seems to make him angry, which is bizarre. He has trumpeted disinformation against President Zelensky. For example, today he said that Zelensky only has 4% support in Ukraine. Absolute nonsense. President Zelensky has support levels exceeding those of Donald Trump in the United States. So that's absolute nonsense. He's repeated talking points from Vladimir Putin suggesting that Ukraine, which is a parliamentary democracy with a presidency, is a fascistic state in some way. Deeply, deeply offensive to a country, Ukraine, which suffered so badly under Germany's fascist invasion. And in particular, it's offensive to President Zelensky, who is Jewish. So, of all the bad weeks Donald Trump has had, he's now 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks into his presidential term, this in many ways is the most offensive. And one particular footnote that struck me as a Scottish person is that J.D. Vance, his vice president, who used to call Trump a fascist and said that he was a never-Trumpist, would never support Donald Trump, and is now knuckled under. He's an intelligent man. He's an educated man. He doesn't believe a word that he's saying, I suspect. But he went to Munich and he repeated some ludicrous, easily disprovable fake news. He said that in Scotland, which he singled out, in Scotland, free speech has been banned. And he said that you're no longer allowed to pray in your own homes, and that the Scottish government had sent letters to people telling them they couldn't pray in their own homes. Well, that came as something of a surprise to people in Scotland like me, who've had no such letters. Of course, it's absolute nonsense. There's freedom of speech and religion in Scotland. It's particularly ironic, of course, given that the White House has just banned the Associated Press, the AP, from press briefings in the White House because the AP refuses to call the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, which Donald Trump says it's now called going forward. So for refusing to do that, they've been thrown out of the White House briefings that they used to attend in the Oval Office. So that's Donald Trump's attitude towards free press. But his vice president has the gall to come to Europe and lecture all of us, and in particular the Scots, about freedom of speech and freedom of religion. These are very dark times in Europe, and there are dark times in the United States too. And I certainly endorse what President Zelensky has said. We have to have European security. We have to defend Ukraine. We have to arm Ukraine. It's not just for Ukraine, but it's for all of us and the international world order. And once again, and I've said this before, never has there been a time when it's more obvious that the United Kingdom should not be isolated post-Brexit, but should be back in the heart of Europe as a member of the European Union, as well as NATO. We can't rely on the United States. We shouldn't be isolated, and we should be looking to our long-term collective European future. I hope you'll subscribe to my channel. It doesn't cost anything at all. Please press subscribe, and please also leave your comments, because I love to read them and I respond to all of them. Thank you for watching.